In 1940, this man accepted the capitulation of France. Now, he climbs the stairs of a wooden scaffold. October 16, 1946. 1 in the morning. Nuremberg. Wilhelm Keitel is 64 years old. He asked for a firing squad. He wanted to die a soldier. The tribunal denied the request. They gave him a rope instead. The boots hit the wooden planks. The gymnasium is cold. He stands on the trapdoor. A guard pulls a black hood over his head. The vision of the Reich is cut off by rough fabric. A lever is pulled. A deafening crash echoes through the hall. The floor disappears. The drop is botched. The rope is too short. He does not die. For 24 minutes, the head of the Wehrmacht strangles in the air. This agony lasts longer than the ceremony of Germany's surrender in May 1945. It is the physical dismantling of the German military machine, one spasm at a time. But before the neck finally snapped, there was the ink on a document that started the war. The doctors pronounced him dead after 24 minutes of struggle. On October 1, 1946, the voice of the tribunal filled the courtroom. 21 men sat in the dock. The remnants of the Third Reich squeezed onto 2 wooden benches. They were not ordinary criminals. They were the architects who turned Europe into a graveyard. The charge was specific: crimes against humanity. The precedent was absolute. Following orders is no excuse. The court stripped away the immunity of the uniform. They put the system itself on trial. Then came the numbers: 12 death sentences, 12 gallows for the elite of the nation. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel sat motionless. He was the symbol of the German military machine. But the court did not grant him a soldier's death by firing squad. They sentenced him to hang like a common murderer. The judgment was absolute. 6 years before the rope, Keitel stood at the center of the world. The location was the Compen Forest. The date was June 22, 1940. Engineers had dragged the museum piece back to the rails. Marshal Foch's personal carriage, number 2419D. The clearing smelled of damp earth and old revenge. Keitel stepped onto the floorboards where Germany had surrendered in 1918. The theater was surgical. 4 years of trench warfare were erased in 6 weeks of blitzkrieg. General Charles Hunziker sat across the table. The French general stared at the document. Keitel signed his name without hesitation. The scratch of the pen dismantled the French Republic. Outside, the new conqueror saluted Hitler. He called the dictator the greatest warlord of all time. The loyalty paid off instantly. Hitler handed him the baton. Keitel became a field marshal. He had reached the absolute peak of the Prussian military hierarchy. But the gold braid did not buy respect. Hermann Göring watched the promotion with a sneer. He later described the new commander as a man with a sergeant's mind inside a field marshal's body. Before he held the marshal's baton, Keitel paid for it in Poland. September 1, 1939. The invasion was a cover for a racial laboratory. Keitel knew the plan before the first shot was fired. Not just conquest, eradication. The army provided the logistics for the crime. On September 7th, Reinhard Heydrich marked the targets: clergy, nobles, Jews. 5 days later, Keitel personally expanded the list. He added the country's brain: doctors, lawyers, village teachers. The Wehrmacht secured the perimeter while the death squads did the work. 60,000 civilians were lined up and shot. That is the entire population of a mid-sized German city. Gone. Field officers vomited at the sights. They sent frantic reports up the chain. Keitel ignored them. He demanded silence until his commanders became too numb to protest. While the intelligentsia died in the mud, the general received his payment for loyalty: 100,000 Reichsmarks. Long before the slaughter in Poland, there was the bloodless capitulation of Vienna. Early 1938, Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg announced a referendum: independence or union. Hitler did not want a vote. He wanted a display of power. Keitel ordered the Wehrmacht to the border, not to fight, but to be seen. Engines roaring, artillery unmasked. It was state-level blackmail. The threat of violence replaced violence itself. Schuschnigg broke. On March 11th, he resigned. The government evaporated. The next day, German columns entered Austria. No resistance, only cheering crowds and flowers on the tanks. The country fell in 24 hours, creating a fatal illusion of easy victories. For this triumph of intimidation, Keitel pinned the Anschluss medal to his chest. To expand the Reich beyond Austria, Hitler did not need a Clausewitz or a Napoleon. He needed a tool. Why did the General Staff despise the second most powerful man in the hierarchy? Because in 1938, the command chain broke at the top. In the corridors of the Bendler block, officers whispered a new name, not Keitel, but Keitel, a pun on lackey, the lackey. Generals bypassed him. They walked straight to the chancellery because they knew the Field Marshal was hollow. Hitler knew it too. He openly called his military chief unintelligent. But the dictator required loyalty as a dog, and the dog never bit the hand that fed it. To install such a puppet at the summit, Hitler had to dismantle the entire command structure. The old Prussian aristocracy would never voluntarily salute a lackey. But January 1933 changed the physics of power. The Nazis didn't just take office, they seized the machinery. By 1935, Keitel led the Armed Forces Office at the Reich Ministry of War. He began fusing the Army, Navy, and Air Force into a single tool. But coordination was not enough. In 1938, Hitler struck the final blow against military independence. He abolished the Ministry of War entirely. In its place rose the OKW, the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. This new bureaucracy subordinated the proud German officer corps to a political party. It was a violation of tradition not seen for 200 years. At its head stood Keitel, now officially the second most powerful man in the military hierarchy. The foundation for the OKW was not laid in 1938. It started in 1924, inside a locked office at the Ministry of the Reichswehr. How do you hide an entire army from the world? You call it a sports club. Sunday mornings on the hillsides, young men launched wooden gliders into the wind. They wore civilian tweed jackets and flat caps. They looked like harmless hobbyists. But watch their hands on the controls. They weren't learning to float. They were practicing dive angles for Stukas. This was the Truppenamt, the troop office, a boring bureaucratic name for a criminal conspiracy. Keitel worked at the center of this machine. The agency existed solely to blind international inspectors. While the world watched the front door, Keitel reorganized the basement. The scale of the fraud was industrial. Sporting associations didn't teach soccer, they taught infantry maneuvers. Agricultural tractor factories produced prototypes for tank chassis. The budget for this secret bureau exceeded the official government spending on German agriculture. Keitel wasn't just a soldier here, he was an architect of a shadow force. He designed the skeleton of the Wehrmacht years before Hitler gave it flesh. The deception was total. When the Nazi Party took power in 1933, they didn't have to build a war machine from scratch. They simply turned the key. The machine of revenge was not built in 1933. It was forged in the Compiègne forest on November 11, 1918. The armistice was not a pause. It was a demolition of the German state. The Treaty of Versailles stripped the nation of 13% of its territory. To understand the trauma, imagine France losing Normandy and Provence overnight. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The borders were redrawn. But the true blow was struck against the military itself. The Allies set a hard limit, 100,000 men. For a great power, this was not an army. It was a police force. Wilhelm Keitel remained inside this hollowed-out structure. He channeled the rage of the dismissed. He helped organize the Freikorps, paramilitary units of bitter veterans who refused to accept defeat. They despised the republic they were sworn to defend. These men turned their weapons inward. Between 1918 and 1922, right-wing veterans committed 354 political assassinations. But long before the shame of Versailles, Keitel's path was severed by hot steel. April 1909. He married Lisa Fontaine. She brought the wealth of a brewery empire. He brought the status of the Prussian officer corps. It was a transaction of power as much as love. She wanted the prestige of the uniform. He ensured she kept it. Then came the war. 1914, the Western Front. Was Keitel a born warrior? No, he was a manager in a trench coat. Flanders proved it. A shrapnel grenade exploded. The sharp crack of detonation followed by the tear of metal. Severe wounds took him off the line. Recovery changed the trajectory. The army didn't need his aim, it needed his paperwork. His organizational talent was undeniable. He traded the mud for a desk. In the spring of 1915, the High Command transferred him to the General Staff. His administrative mind was built for harvest ledgers, not invasion plans. If not for a family dispute, the Field Marshal would have remained a farmer. Wilhelm Keitel was born on September 22, 1882. The estate in Helmscherode was his intended world. But the soil turned cold early. In 1889, fever took his mother. Wilhelm was 6. He grew up expecting the title of landowner, but his father refused to relinquish control. The patriarch clung to the property. The son was left with a name, but no earth. The estate at Helmscherode had survived centuries of European turmoil. The empire Keitel would later serve would burn to ash in just 12 years. Denied his inheritance, Wilhelm turned to the state. In 1901, he joined the Prussian artillery. It was a career choice born of necessity, not passion. He traded the plow for the cannon. 4 decades later, this decision would culminate in a loyalty bonus of 100,000 marks and a rope around his neck. At 1:11 in the morning, the field marshal stepped into the hatch to die. But death refused to come. Why did the execution of the chief military official take 24 minutes instead of 3? Because the calculation was wrong. Keitel had climbed the 13 wooden steps with steady knees. He stood before Chaplain Henry Gericke. He invoked the Almighty and the memory of 2 million dead German soldiers. He asked for mercy. But the gymnasium in Nuremberg had none to give. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor swung open. Gravity took him, but the mechanics failed. The wooden door swung back and struck his head with a dull, wet thud. The drop was too short. The vertebrae did not snap. Keitel did not die. He strangled. Standard military protocol dictates a broken neck and unconsciousness within seconds. This was different. He hung at the end of the rope, convulsing, fighting for air while blood dripped from the gash on his forehead. 24 minutes of agony. The man who had sent armies to their destruction was reduced to a twitching body. The rope choked him, but the airway remained partially open. The doctors checked the wrist. They waited. The struggle for oxygen continued for 24 minutes. That 24-minute delay was not a fluke. It was a pattern written in blood. The mechanics of the gallows were flawed from the start. The trapdoors in the gymnasium floor were cut too narrow. As the condemned dropped, they didn't just fall, they collided. Their heads smashed against the timber edges of the hatch on the way down. Wood met bone. Lieutenant Stanley Tills, who coordinated the operation, watched the chaos unfold on October 16, 1946. He later testified that this was no accident. He claimed the hangman deliberately misaligned the noose on Julius Streicher. The coil was placed off-center. It was designed to strangle, not to break the neck. Streicher fell, but he didn't die. The rope strangled him, but not fast enough. Reporter Howard K. Smith watched from the gallery. He saw the hangman descend from the platform. The executioner stepped behind the black canvas curtain concealing the thrashing body. A moment later, the rasping gasps abruptly stopped. Smith believed the hangman finished the job with his bare hands. The evidence remained on the film. The post-mortem photographs of Keitel and the others show faces battered and covered in blood. The architect of this butchery was a man who never should have touched the lever. Master Sergeant John C. Woods volunteered in 1944. He walked into the office with a resume full of dead men. He claimed extensive experience hanging convicts in Texas and Oklahoma. It was a lie. Those states didn't use ropes. They used the electric chair. Picture the interview. Woods leans forward, a small, confident smile on his lips. He sells the fiction of expertise. Cut to reality. In Texas, there were no trapdoors, only the hum of high voltage and the smell of ozone. The electric chair had replaced the gallows years prior. The last legal hanging in Texas happened in 1923. Woods was 12 years old at the time. A single phone call would have exposed him. The Army never made it. Instead, they let him practice on their own. Between 1944 and 1946, Woods botched 11 executions. 11 American soldiers strangled to death on his watch.
And then the Army sent him to Nuremberg.
While Woods gave interviews, the U.S. Army stamped official denials. The press release described a clinical procedure: quick, professional, humane. But journalist Howard K. Smith saw the gymnasium floor. The trapdoors were too narrow. As the bodies dropped, heads slammed against the wood. Blood sprayed the platform. Was this the justice of civilization, or the blind revenge of the victors? Woods certainly enjoyed it. He told reporters he really wanted this job. He called the dying men arrogant criminals. A small, smug smile played on his lips. The Allies had promised a legal triumph, not a slaughter. But on October 16, 1946, the moral high ground collapsed. The Army did not fire the executioner. They classified the evidence. To understand the filth of the execution, you must rewind the tape to October 1st. The verdict broke the man before the rope did. Wilhelm Keitel, guilty on all 4 counts. The field marshal stood before the bench with one final plea. He demanded a firing squad. For a Prussian officer, the bullet is a right. It implies a soldier's death. It preserves the illusion of honor. The tribunal dismantled that illusion. They were explicit. Keitel's actions were not military strategy. They were criminal atrocities. The judges ruled that you do not shoot a gangster. You hang him. The Allied Control Council confirmed the sentence: death by hanging, with all military privileges denied. Can an army chief justify himself by saying he had no choice? The answer sat in the Nuremberg dock. Wilhelm Keitel, stripped of his baton, stripped of his uniform, slumped shoulders in a cheap civilian jacket. The indictment hit him with 4 counts: conspiracy against peace, aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Keitel did not deny the paper trail. He admitted he knew the orders were illegal. He always knew. But he played the only card he had left: duty. He claimed the terror grew step by step, beyond his control. That a soldier does not question, a soldier obeys. The tribunal saw a war criminal trying to save his neck. But the man sitting across from him in the cell saw something pathetic. Captain G.M. Gilbert, the prison psychologist. He spent hundreds of hours talking to the former field marshal. He analyzed the man who signed the death warrants of millions. Gilbert didn't find a fanatic. He found a void. His final clinical assessment fits on a single line: he has no more backbone than a jellyfish. Yet the man who offered no resistance in the courtroom had been the one to officially shut down the slaughter. May 8, 1945, Berlin. The ruins of the capital still smoked. Alfred Jodl had signed a surrender in Reims the day before. The Soviets threw it out. They knew history. They remembered the stab in the back myth of 1918, the dangerous lie that Germany was betrayed from within, not beaten on the field. Moscow demanded absolute clarity. No proxies, no doubts. The supreme commander had to sign it himself. Keitel put his name on the definitive instrument of surrender. With one stroke of a pen, he legally ended World War II in Europe. The man who built the machine officially dismantled it. Minutes later, Allied police took him into custody. The signature in Berlin was an act of defeat, but his signature in 1944 was an act of murder against his own caste. It started with a personal price. July 1941. A Soviet strike kills Hans Georg, Keitel's youngest son. The invasion Keitel planned had devoured his own flesh and blood. He buried the boy and returned to his desk. By July 20th, 1944, the officer in him was dead. When the bomb ripped through the wolf's lair, Keitel scrambled through the debris to embrace Hitler. The reprisal was total: 5,000 executions. Keitel presided over the court of honor, stripping generals of their rank to feed them to the hangman. Then the crosshairs settled on a legend. Erwin Rommel. Hitler needed the Desert Fox dead but couldn't risk a public trial. Keitel brokered the deal. He dispatched 2 generals to Rommel's home with a clear ultimatum. On the table sat a glass ampule of cyanide. The terms: suicide in exchange for his family's safety. Rommel swallowed the capsule in the back of a staff car. Propaganda claimed he died from strafing wounds in Normandy. The lie protected the regime's image. Keitel stood by the coffin at the state funeral, offering a final salute to the colleague he had just forced to kill himself. How did one man turn a professional army into a machine for killing civilians? The betrayal of Rommel was just the finale. The rot began years earlier, in April 1941. They said he wore a field marshal's uniform, but inside beat the heart of a subservient sergeant. Small, obedient, fatal. Keitel sat at his desk, the pen scratched across the paper. With that single stroke, he erased the laws of war. The order was explicit. German soldiers were exempt from prosecution for crimes against civilians. Murder became policy. The math of terror was precise. The directive demanded 50 to 100 executions for every single German death. So-called communists, Jews, bystanders. The specific target did not matter, only the body count. Then came the night and fog decree. The heavy stamp hit the document. Nacht und Nebel. The ink dried and the machinery of abduction started. A truck engine idling at 3 a.m. A door forced open. By dawn, the bedroom was empty. No arrest warrant, no trial. Families stared at cold breakfast, waiting for news that would never arrive. 7,000 people vanished into the void. That is the population of a small town, deleted by a bureaucrat's signature. Those who survived the initial interrogation disappeared into the camps at Gross Rosen or Natzweiler-Struthof. This was not accidental brutality. Keitel designed the terror to break the will of the occupied by destroying hope itself. The path from the criminal decrees of 1941 led straight to the muddy banks of the river Isar in 1946. Wilhelm Keitel was 64 years old. He was not a fool. He was not a victim of circumstance. He understood every death sentence he signed. For a decade, he faced the same choice every morning: conscience or career, morality or comfort. He chose the uniform every single time. He called it duty. The tribunal called it murder. There was no funeral, no grave. The Allies cremated the body to prevent a shrine. They took the remains to a bridge in Munich. A soldier tipped the canister. Gray ash hit the dark, cold water. It swirled on the surface for a second, then dissolved into the current. History is rarely clean. The civilization that hanged Keitel for laws broken outside the battlefield may have broken its own laws inside that gymnasium. The botched drop, the bloody face, the 20 minutes of agony. Justice is never simple. If you value the uncomfortable truth, subscribe to Dark Room Archive. Share this history. Was that final act justice, or was it revenge?